In this edition of If I Could Change the World, we take a look at the events of the 1989 democracy movement and in particular the Tiananmen Square protests. Throughout history, change has been driven by dissident movements that have arisen to actively challenge established doctrines, policies or institutions, especially the policies of political organizations such as government. In order to understand the true role and contributions of dissidents in China during the 1970s and 80s, it is first important to understand the political context in which Chinese dissidents arose. The growth in dissident groups and the origins and nature of events in Tiananmen Square in June 1989 can be traced back to the rule of Mao Zedong, the man responsible for the foundation of the People's Republic of China in 1949. During the period of his reign, which was characterized by the decimation of economic output, and effectively led to the deaths of between 40 and 70 million people due to starvation, forced labor and executions, Mao was able to maintain some degree of public popularity through a tight control of the media. Deng Xiaoping's emergence as the paramount leader following Mao's death focused on economic reform, placing heavy emphasis on widespread modernization. Despite recognizing the need for political reform, Deng and other Chinese leaders showed little hesitation in severely punishing any perceived threats to communist rule. Against this background of cultural and economic upheaval, the dissident movement was formed. During the 1970s and 80s, it involved the rejection of and protesting against various reform policies implemented by the Communist Party, and calls for urgent reform of the political system. The majority of Chinese dissidents were students, who represented the intellectual elite and who understood the economic and political reforms available to China. Angered by the stubborn refusal towards political reform, in addition to the rise of official corruption, dissidents were prompted into engaging in a 2-month-long pro-democracy demonstration at the heart of the Chinese capital, Tiananmen Square. Additionally, the spark that lit the events at Tiananmen Square can be attributed to the death of Hu Yaobang on April 15, 1989. While a member of the senior leadership, Hu maintained a positive public image through his incorruptibility and push for a more transparent Chinese government, in disagreement with other communist leaders. Having lost the power struggle on the direction of political and economic reform, Hu was demoted. For 50,000 students on April 22, 1989, the mourning for Hu Yaobang became a public conduit for anger against corruption within the Chinese government, and the unfair dismissal of Hu. These protests eventually escalated into the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989, with Hu's promotion of the ideas of freedom of speech and freedom of press greatly influencing the nature of the student participation in the protests. The magnitude of the Tiananmen Square protests would soon escalate, prompting a severe reaction from the Chinese government. Aware of the planned use of the square for a visit by Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev on May 13th, the students began a hunger strike which they saw as a bargaining chip which would influence the government to meet its demands. In addition, the strike saw the students gain widespread sympathy from the general population, earning the student movement the moral high ground. The event in Beijing inspired others, with protests commencing at universities across the country, as well as an increase in the protesters joining the cause at Tiananmen Square. Initial conciliatory advances were put forward by the Chinese government through a soft approach involving diplomatic negotiations with the dissident movement. On the 4th of June 1989, the Chinese government's stance was altered dramatically to one of violence, involving a severe crackdown on behavior it deemed a threat to the Communist Party. Multiple units of the People's Liberation Army advanced and opened fire on protesters in Tiananmen Square. Official government figures reported 241 deaths, while Amnesty International estimates up to 1,000 deaths. The events of the dissident movement in China and its suppression during the events at the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989 resulted in large-scale, widespread repercussions, both domestically and internationally. Domestically, there has been a lack of reform of the political system, with previous desires for reform being reduced by China's strong economic growth and living standards. Additionally, the perceived success of the current political system in delivering political order, foreign policy successes, and qualified new leaders has offset the belief of need to reform. Another domestic result of the events of Tiananmen Square is increasing sophistication of censorship, especially through the 1998 Golden Shield project, commonly referred to as the Great Firewall of China. The actions of the dissident movement have been censored on the internet and downplayed in the media. Furthermore, content regarding the events of the protests has largely been removed from educational teachings as part of the Chinese government censorship programs. Internationally, the events at Tiananmen initially had a large impact. In the immediate aftermath of the protests, the general attitude amongst the wealthier nations was one of shock, prompting the G7 governments to impose sanctions on China. However, strong economic growth in China and the desire of Western nations to tap into its large markets, capital, and cheap labor force has somewhat faded the memories of Tiananmen Square, with business communities and foreign governments placing emphasis on maintaining good relations with the Chinese regime. 25 years ago, up to 1,000 people gave their lives for a cause which they believed mattered, thereby leaving an indelible mark on the world. Given the opportunity, how will you change the world?